Well, good evening. Welcome. My name is Brian Green, and I am the co-president of the Center for Palladian Studies in America. Dale Hilton is our other co-president. It's joined us here. You'll see her next to me or diagonally from me. I'm not sure what's happening on your screen. But it is my pleasure to introduce to you this evening Madison Spencer, an architect whose work, if you don't know it already, you will surely greatly enjoy. I'm grateful for Madison for kindly agreeing to share the work of his architectural practice, as well as the way he practices his craft with us this evening. This is the Center for Palladian Studies in America's second virtual talk. For CPSA members, you will certainly recognize Madison's name from another context. He kindly agreed to join the CPSA board last year and has been helping us to shape our programming to reach out to our existing members as well as to new members. If you are not a CPSA member and you enjoy this evening's talk, please consider joining us. A link to our website is available in the chat. Madison received his undergraduate degree from Washington and Lee University and began his first career in banking. Success as a banker did not suppress an interest in architecture. First studying at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, and then enrolled in the MArch program at the University of Virginia's School of Architecture. It was there that he came under the influence of Dean Jack Robertson. Dean Robertson oversaw a program that was accepting of a variety of approaches to contemporary architecture, which included a carefully cultivated specialty in the rediscovery of classical architecture and its reinvention as a style for contemporary consumption. After graduation, Madison began his career writing the guidelines for the redevelopment of the Miller Park Historic District in historic Chattanooga and assisting in the design of a new quad at Princeton under the direction of Boston architect Fred Cotter. In 1986, he joined Eisenman Robinson Architects in New York. Madison guided and assisted on several residential designs, as well as directed two large-scale international urban planning efforts, one for Jack Robertson and the other for Peter Eisenman, in what one might describe as perhaps the most uniquely bifurcated architectural office in the world at the time, though one that clearly reflected Robertson's approach to leading UVA School of Architecture. Madison ultimately formed his own office, initially in partnership and then leading his own firm. He's undertaken projects with celebrated designers and antiquarians Ralph Harvard, John Saladino, David Easton, and Susan Kassler. Creative collaboration is at the very heart of Madison's architectural practice. Madison is a member of the American Institute of Architects, sits on the board of the International Network for Traditional Building, Architecture and Urbanism based in London, and is or has been involved in many other arts-related boards and public organizations. Among Madison's many forays into public service was his gubernatorial appointment to the Board of Historic Resources of the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, where as a staff member, I first met Madison many years ago. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Madison Spencer. Thank you, Madison.
Ryan, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for skirting all of the dangerous behavior I may have engaged in earlier in my life. Welcome, Palladians. Welcome to this Zoom chat. You are not privy to all of the difficulties we just engaged in for the past 30 minutes. As much as I appreciate Zoom conferences and what have you, setting these things up is just beyond my pay grade. Half of my office has been running around trying to put out fires and figure this thing out. I think we're up and running, and with luck we'll get through this tonight. So I'm appreciative for all that Brian and Mark and everyone at CPSA has done to make this happen. When CPSA first approached me a couple of months ago, and suggested that we talk about, they wanted to do a couple of Zoom calls where there was an opportunity to talk about architectural work today. I thought long and hard over the past couple of weeks and imagine that given the nature of the mission of CPSA, there was value in considering how Palladianism, how that whole world of rules of composition, proportion that were so critical and crucial to that era, the Renaissance in Italy, how they affect my work today and a lot of other people's work. Um, and so this is a little bit of a digression from the typical show and tell sort of lecture that one might engage in. What I want to talk about first is some ideas that came early on, over 2,000 years ago, that guide us still today. Um, I'm sitting here. I'm going to try and push this slide thing. Let's see if we can get this thing going. There. Um, uh, Whether it's building libraries, town halls, houses, or sheds, there are principles of proportion, principles of composition developed during the Golden Age of Greece, um, further refined during the Renaissance, that are essentially guardrails, rules of the game, that are as easily applied today and tomorrow as they were before. The image on your screens now is of the Acropolis. Um, Athens in its time was at the top of culture and society, and this was the apogee of accomplishments in that era. I mean, to begin any discussions of proportion, you have to start with Greece, you have to start with Athens, and that means the Acropolis. We we know that in that era, Pythagoras had discovered the connection between music and mathematics, and that these intervals employed in music, the octave, the fifth, the fourth, ratios of 2 to 1, 3 to 2, 4 to 3, respectively, were perfect consonances. Consonance is when two or more notes blend to create a pleasant sound. This is the case whether it's on a guitar or a flute or a piano. Um, these proportions were also understood to be useful in building, and the results were good. Over the course of 1,000 years, the Acropolis, as it developed, was ransacked twice, used for target practice, pillaged by collectors, finally declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But even in a state of ruin, the temples and monuments were so robustly built that enough remains for us to extrapolate and appreciate how fantastic that hilltop was. And it's funny to me, and I think to many of us, how even ruined great cities like the Acropolis, like Herculaneum, like Pompeii, remain compelling today. Of all those buildings on the Acropolis, all those monuments, the Parthenon there at the top is perhaps the most complete. The scale and engineering of the Parthenon is truly mind-boggling. Measured at its base, at the stylobate, the Parthenon is just over 100 feet wide, 228 feet long. The Doric columns at its facade are 6 feet in diameter, 30 feet, 34 feet tall. Now, there's several proportional games at play here, all again predicated upon what Pythagoras had discovered and was employing not only in music, but now in architecture. So these proportional games involved things like the golden rectangle and other proportional arrangements. Mark, you may have to help me. I'm pushing a button here and nothing seems to be happening. Should we try the next slide? There we go. Whoops. Let's go back. This screen shows all of the principal ratios, proportional tricks that were employed in that era. Some incredibly basic, just 1 to 1, a square. The double square, ratios 3 to 4, 3 to 5, 2 to 3. Some involving square roots, bisections and angles of triangles and how they fit within various geometric conditions. Level of complexity there, but all fundamentally, I mean, this was the full bag of tricks, basically. And that is not all. It wasn't just the Parthenon. All of these structures on the Acropolis, the Erechtheion, the Odeon of Herodotus Atticus, the Temple of Athena, the Propylaea, all of these structures employed proportional arrangements and games um, that were pleasing to the eye. And by 400 BC, it was well understood these proportional relationships, if managed wisely, would result in something truly beautiful. Fast forward to 400 years, and Greece was under Roman rule. So basically, 0 AD. But these design methodologies had been absorbed and disseminated throughout the far-flung Roman Empire. Let me see if I can do this. There we go. There's the Parthenon, with its golden rectangle relationship. There were many other ratios that could be discerned from that, but I thought this would be appropriate to take a look at. So here we are. I include this image of the Maison Carré in Nîmes, France. Not even in Rome. This was a far-flung region in its time of the Roman Empire, because it was perhaps the only physical link that our dearly beloved Thomas Jefferson had with great Roman or even Italian Renaissance architecture. While as a diplomat and private citizen, he traveled widely in France, 3 times to England, but only ventured briefly once into northern Italy. Never went to Rome, never firsthand saw the work of Palladio in the Veneto or Venice. And if Calder Loth is watching this presentation, he might do well to comment during the Q&A. But I think I'm right in saying this. This was the only pure Roman classical work that Jefferson was able to set his eyes on. Everything else he learned from books. This Roman temple ultimately served as Jefferson's precedent for the Capitol in Virginia, a perfect model for the new classicism of an American democracy. Simple, forthright, well-proportioned, bold in its presentation. Now, these books, let's pop here, this is probably an image similar to what Jefferson would have seen of the Maison Carré. He saw drawings first before he actually physically stood in front of it. Proportional analysis of the Maison Carré. So what's interesting is also during this era, architects, whether trained professionally or as Jefferson, a gentleman, or his daughter, a gentlewomanly architect, they would be pulling out their compass and scale and measuring these ad infinitum to try and decipher, why is this particular arrangement so elegantly balanced and fundamentally beautiful? And in some respects, by the time of the Renaissance, it was understood that this was it was understood that man was potentially at the center of all of this, but even the physical proportions of a person, a human being, spoke to this sensibility of proportion and composition and scale and balance. And so we can thank Leonardo da Vinci for this reinterpretation of the Vitruvian Man. But this for me speaks volumes as to the difference between what was being considered at 400 BC and with Leonardo da Vinci, where on one hand, Greek and Roman gods were being celebrated. And with Leonardo da Vinci in the Renaissance, it was man, it was a human being. I think it's worth sharing this list, and this is my concoction, and others may differ. The first name on the list is Vitruvius. Vitruvius was responsible for the only written treatise explaining how these proportions, these early Greek proportions worked, and how they could be employed as a system, as guidelines for construction. Everyone else on that list, those next 7, 8 names, Brunelleschi, Alberti, Da Vinci, Serlio, Buonarroti, Michelangelo, Palladio, Inigo Jones, the only Brit, and Bernini. And there are other names, but these were the most important. These fellows, uh, beyond the work they designed, put on paper ideas and guidelines for how these rules of proportion and composition might be conveyed to others. And the last name on the list, Thomas Jefferson. Um, this was this was all that he required. Uh, he was he was committed to understanding from all of these historical figures what the methodologies that could be discerned that might guide him in terms of how he thought of the universe. Um, and that in and of itself is another story, but I digress. Um, so on to Plaudio. Um, of these treatises, it was Palladio's 4 books of architecture that captivated Thomas Jefferson most. It was no doubt of interest to the Smart Set in London, the book dealers there from whom Jefferson ordered all of his books would have been promoting this. There were abbreviated pre-seed editions, one referred to as the Palladio Londinensis, which was, I think, also called the London Art of Building, which is a smaller folio that Jefferson would distribute to builder friends and architect or gentleman friends as a guide for how to design structures. And in any event, Palladio's 4 books were well illustrated. Uh, it wasn't until this point, with the invention of the movable type, Gutenberg's press, that any of these things could be widely circulated beyond what you might send in a letter to a friend. Uh, these drawings represent proportional analyses of the Villa Rotunda. And these are analyses that were done in our office. If there's no doubt in my mind that if you were to go online, you might find many others that are different in terms of how they approach this. But in all of this, what we were trying to do, our gang, was trying to decipher how all of this fits together so beautifully, not only in elevation, but in plan. There is a purity to all of this that is beyond the pale. And there's a sidebar conversation that a friend of mine, Ralph Harvey, and I had last night regarding the influences that Jefferson and his comrades might have gathered from books or seen in England. And there are clearly important houses that it's likely that he saw. But again, most of this was coming from being deciphered and learned from books that were now widely available, or prints of buildings and designs that were widely available. So here we are, 1800. 1817, the University of Virginia, the lawn, where with luck and pluck, a new nation had been born. Um, and new nations deserve new iconic architecture and new places of learning. And Thomas Jefferson was keen to create a new university and with a truly classical scientific renaissance uh, manner in which to educate the citizens of the future. Um, Obviously, on his own terms, it was his sensibility, it was his notion of what was required to do this. But interestingly enough, and unlike any university that had been formed to date, and most of the Ivies were already in operation by the time the University of Virginia was started. Um, but in this case, Jefferson was imagining something of wholly new, of new cloth, a new construct entirely. With instead of virtually every university prior, instead of a chapel or a church at the center of all of that, Jefferson chose a library. This was not the first scheme. And this speaks to the whole collaborative effort and undertaking for this. Following his presidency in 1818, Jefferson had formed a commission, the Rockfish Gap Commission, to plan for this new university and where it might be built. There was some discussion, some debate where it might be. It was decided it would be within close proximity of Washington, but it all played out ultimately according to Jefferson's direction, and it would be near Charlottesville proper. All the better for him to control the undertaking. Uh, and it's if any of you have an opportunity and an interest, I cannot recommend enough strongly. Um, the value in visiting the Albert and Shirley Small Rare Books collection at the University of Virginia. For those of us like Brian who have been there and seen these drawings, the amazing cache, the amazing volume of information held in that collection, correspondence, letters, drawings that speak to how this was considered is just, it's beyond the pale. I wholly recommend it. Um, the but here we are. You know, this was a design. This was drawn after the fact, because the fact of the matter is they were winging it to a great extent when they were building this. It was unclear to them the character of the topography. As I mentioned before, this started out as a square, developed into a more of a rectangle. This geometric construct, this is again ours, done within our office by our gang. But it I wonder if Jefferson even considered all of this, because they were having to deal with topographic conditions and how you actually build something this scale in the landscape. Um, at the head of it, obviously, was the rotunda. This was the last structure to be built. It was the focal point. Um, it's a half scale model of the Parthenon in Rome. And again, Jefferson had never seen it. He was only relying upon drawings. Uh, and he definitely labored over how to envision this structure. Uh, this is a drawing. I think many had their doubts that it was his drawing personally. I think many think it was his daughter's. Um, and this again is in the rare book collection. Um, But there was a great deal of effort put to how this might be arranged such that there was a purity of form. Um, and this was at the head of the composition, again, reinforcing the fact that knowledge would guide the future of this nation as opposed to religion. This is one of the last pavilions built. And the reason for my showing this is that it's such a delightful exercise in proportion and composition. It's the smallest pavilion on the lawn. It's number 9, the last in the chain on the west side of the lawn. This was designed, we know for a fact, designed in collaboration with Benjamin Latrobe, a good friend of Thomas Jefferson's, truly one of the first architects of the United States. Amazingly simple in composition, but exquisitely proportioned. This is a view of the pavilion looking through colonnade here at the colonnade with this Chippendale railings, beautiful composition, showing a golden rectangle anchoring that center block. This in plan, very simply arranged. All of these pavilions arranged such that the classrooms were on the ground floor, faculty above. But they were to be architectural lessons. They were this whole, what many have heard of as the Harkness table approach to education, where it's a round table and students are gathered around in conversation with a professor as opposed to be lectured to. This was an approach that was very important to Jefferson. I may have slipped ahead of myself here. In any event, here we are. We've gone through 2,250 years of architectural history. And now I'm going to show you a couple of things that I've done that are predicated upon our appreciation, my appreciation of all of these things that have come before. Newport, Rhode Island has always been important to me. When I left New York and moved back to Virginia, my wife and I wanted to have a place other than Manhattan, someplace with green to raise our children. But my professional life was spent roaming the eastern seaboard and these historic communities, from New York to South Carolina, Georgia. That was my, at that time, range of operation. And Newport is special in that it is perhaps one of the most important, has the most important cache of early colonial architecture in the United States. Newport, Charleston, Savannah to some extent, the James River as well for its great houses. But Newport has just a ton of it. And it is just literally block by block. One of my favorite structures there is this Redwood Library and Athenaeum. This was, I believe, the first subscription library formed in the United States. In that era, you subscribed to a library. They weren't totally open to the public. And this structure was designed. The library was formed in 1747, designed by Peter Harrison, and some would refer to him as one of our first true architects. Harrison had a hand in some of the most important public structures in Newport. the Redwood Library, the Redwood Athenaeum is a perfectly scaled Palladian folly. Uh, the Doric columns stand 17 feet tall. They span 30 feet at the base, including the wings. Either side, the entire width is 52 feet. So this is not very big. The library room itself, and I don't have a good photograph of that, unfortunately, behind that pediment in those columns is 26 feet wide and 39, 38 feet long. So it's basically a 2-to-3 proportion and plan. The ceiling height is 16 feet. It's ringed with early portraits of prominent subscribers to the library and Newport and Rhode Island citizens. I actually copied the library for a client in Somerset, Virginia, and that's a topic for another conversation, another lecture. It is restrained in scale. It is easy to imagine the Redwood Library as a house. The proportions are sublime. South of the Redwoods Athenaeum, off Bellevue Avenue on Narragansett Avenue, right in the middle of the Bellevue Historic District, was a vacant lot. This was an early project for me. We maintained a small office in Newport because of some renovations and rehabilitations we were involved in. This was a vacant lot split off from a grand house designed by Ogden Codman called Bois d'Oreille. And it was small, but perhaps one of the last lots in this historic district. I was out of the blue. A couple walked into our office in Newport. One a member of the Garden Club, the other a banker, successful banker from Boston. And they asked point blank if we might help them design a house. They had found a lot, this lot. In Newport, how could we pitch in? Those are all redwood. Sorry about that. These were some initial sketches. Narragansett is at the top of the page. And like many houses, you often put the front door facing the principal street. But it's not a big lot. And and they were gardeners as well. And the resulting spaces, proved inadequate. So we had to sort of rethink this. And thankfully, let's see if here we go. Thankfully, we were understanding of how circumstances like this were dealt with in places like Charleston, South Carolina, where often houses there are at right angles to the principal street. This is also a common arrangement in European cities where you hope to gain privacy and arrange more commodious, more spacious gardens. So, these two diagrams were what we ended up gravitating to. The first one's actually on the right. The one that began to guide us ultimately is the one on the left. And this incorporates a 5-part Palladian plan, swept wings, and we were using Mount Airy in Richmond County, which I think is probably one of the first Palladian villas built in the United States in 1764, as a model for the arrangement. We were able to tuck the house closer to the property line to the side and allow for a grander garden to the backside, to the west. And so this is often how we start a project. These are sketches that I made early on, taking into account the swept wings and how they might be appointed. Very similar again to Mount Airy. Um, and again, a rough sketch here. Um, it's not a big house. It's only 46 feet wide at its face, 38 feet deep. Um, one master bedroom, one owner's bedroom tucked into the building to the right, a greenhouse pavilion to the left, two bedrooms upstairs. But it's all simply arranged uh, and not of an excessive scale. I admit to hewing to traditional construction methodologies. Um, I like building with real materials. The walls of this house are 14 inches thick. They're solid block and brick. We chose a traditional stucco. Here it is in, whoops. There it is in plan. Um, we chose a traditional stucco, and all of the all of the detailing was done in limestone, and our interest in detailing really gets into everything. This is an image of the front door, um, and the proportional arrangement of that. Photograph of the front of the house here, and again, a much more European arrangement. No lawn in front of the house. The courtyard is right against the front door itself. Uh, there, the front door. Um, a, a, a version of something I had seen before in England, but with this ionic arrangement and a studded door, a wrought iron lantern above, all of this in limestone, um, in the centerpiece of the house. Um, it was a great way to build in Newport, and and this is how we like to build still today. Um, we unfortunately, because we arranged that whole site plan on that garden uh, to the west in the Copper Beach, which centered all of that, which was struck by lightning, suffered from some horrible infiltration of bugs or what have you, ultimately fell down. We had to take it down. So in its place, we decided to build a pavilion as a centerpiece. We needed an eye catcher for the composition. So this was an early sketch for a pavilion that might serve that purpose. Here's a diagrammatic analysis, proportional analysis of how we might put that all together, um, and arrange that, all predicated upon a plan close to a golden rectangle arrangement. And there it is, literally smack dab on the site of where the Copper Beach once stood. Open to the elements, only has a fireplace, does have electricity, um, and but it complements the house nicely. Here's a view back through to the house. Greenhouse on the right, master owner's bedroom to the left. My happy client strolling in just to say hello. Um, and in these sorts of compositions where things are buttoned up and organized in a fashion that leaves no stone unturned, both in terms of architecture and landscape, is how we tend to operate. It's kind of the way I think. The second project is a bit smaller. Maybe the house itself is not. Um, but one of my best friends and his charming wife, we were in each other's weddings. Um, After a whirlwind of successes in New York and then California, they decided that San Francisco was perhaps not the best place to raise a family. And they decided to abandon ship and try a bit of Virginia country life. So they settled on this curious enclave, Greenwood, Virginia, west of Charlottesville. Fantastic Virginia countryside, where there is a cache of exceptional estates from the latter half of the 19th century and early 20th century. Several of which were designed or renovated by William Lawrence Bottomley, a New York architect, but who had been latched onto by Virginia gentry and thrived from the early 1900s into the late 1940s. Bottomley was responsible for most of the great houses in Windsor Farms in Richmond and several great houses on Monument Avenue as well. Bottomley was particularly adept with Georgian brick designs, some modeled on Westover, on the James River. And it's interesting, too, that Bottomley was responsible for even commercial undertakings. He was well regarded in New York City. River House on the East River, one of the grand apartment blocks that existed that was built right during the heights of Depression, Bottomley was responsible for. But in any event, here we are, Blue Ridge Farm. Our clients had zeroed in on this. And I was certainly on board. And lo and behold, they called one day and said they had read this article in the magazine Antiques about this fellow, Ralph Harvard, who they were impressed by and who struck them as perhaps a good collaborator. And at that time, Ralph was recognized as one of the great brains, experts relative to Virginia colonial architecture. My response was, of course, anything that my friends Chuck and Kim Corey would suggest, I was on board for. And Ralph was pretty cool. To cross paths with someone with that level of expertise was fortuitous, was just good fortune for me. The house was in terrible state. That mansarded roof, third floor, was on the verge of collapse. We had some considerable structural problems that had to be taken care of. It was a top to bottom renovation, but not difficult because Bottomley, in his work in the 1920s, 30s, had set good rules for us. And from the standpoint of how rooms might be arranged architecturally, it was easy. Ralph actually had the harder job appointing them and helping with furniture, selecting colors, fabrics, what have you. But we had a ton of fun, and our clients are great collectors. This house is packed with just exceptional furniture, paintings, pictures, maps. There's a particularly good collection of early Virginia maps. But talking about the house any further than that is total separate lecture entirely. Um, they use this nonstop. This is their home. They've sold virtually, they've sold all of their other properties. And this is where they entertain. This is where their children are getting married. Their son Charlie married in that picture to the right. They're the happy parents there. Um, and but what really became a challenge beyond the house was trying to decide what to do with the rest of the property. And one of the big things, one of the big missions we had to deal with was this structure, number two on this site plan, which was a pool and pool gazebo that had been plopped there on that lawn, probably sometime in the 1980s. It was clear that it was beyond the fact that it was an eyesore. Um, we had to get rid of this thing. We used it during construction and work on the main house so that the children had a place to swim and have fun while we were working away. Um, but we had to figure out what was how to improve this whole arrangement. Three, the bullet there to the right, denotes where there was a series of walls in the stable beyond. And we decided that might be a pretty good spot for where we might park a small pool pavilion, small pleasure house. Uh, the This is a view through existing stone walls. That's our gate back to the main house. Bottomley often collaborated with a fellow by the name of Charles Gillette. Gillette was a transplant from the Midwest, as I recall, lived in Richmond. During the Depression, he started a landscape architecture design practice, really had tremendous success, as much success as anyone could have during the Depression. And they often worked together on projects. Bottomley loved boxwoods, and every project that he was involved in has lots of boxwoods. Bottomley loved stone walls. Um, there's over a mile of stone walls. It's Blue Ridge Farm. And the beauty of that is that with those stone walls, with those boxwoods, there's a beautiful array of garden rooms that are incredibly private and discreet. And we decided we would that's where this pool house deserved to be. Um, this is one of our plans, first plans here. My sketch. Uh, that's the whole idea was to have two pavilion structures left and right with a common sitting room between, pool in front. Um, this was also an era when I was infatuated with triangular garden pavilions, which Lutchens and his buddy garden designer Gertrude Jekyll were fond of, and you see all over their gardens in England. Um, but the plan was simple enough, and we pretty much stuck with this. Uh, we did, as we formalized it again, working stuff left and right, common sitting room wide open in the center, a very very simple plan arrangement, proportionally sound. We looked at using pedimented pavilion fronts, side left to right, but we decided it was a little too dour in the predictable Virginia columns, even though beautifully proportioned, and this would be perfectly suitable. I'd be happy with it. It seemed to to not be up to the game. Um, Early sketch of mine, one of the pavilions hugging the wall, triangular pavilions. Uh, so what we zeroed in on is a result of peering over, investigating other options. Ralph and I were spying on other bottomly arrangements, and we came across a similar arrangement in Richmond and Windsor Farms, where there were these pyramidal roof pavilions bracketing a central sitting room. And we latched onto that because of the fact that we didn't have to be wed to full bore Virginia columns. Um, and we chose colonnettes that might be made out of iron. And we started to play with these roof arrangements, these bell jar roof arrangements, um, that are modeled on mulberry plantation on the Cooper River, down in South Carolina. Um, and something that was much more playful, um, and a little bit more personable. This is the plan with some overlay analysis just to verify that we were moving in the right direction. A site plan showing the whole arrangement and the interplay between pool, pavilion, and this magnificent white oak upon which we centered all of it. Um, and that was to the west directly, provided fantastic shade to the pavilion. Again, like what we endured in Newport, it was struck by lightning, ended up dying. Um, but we saved the trunk because it was just so fantastically sculptural. And I'm sorry we don't have a picture of that. But this whole composition, what I want to emphasize is that this play of proportion and composition occurs across the board, whether it is in elevation plan, site plan, um, in detail as well. Uh, a photograph of the facade at the pool. Um, again, I think I may have mentioned we chose stucco. You can't really see the drawn lines. They're barely perceptible here. And that's probably good. Standing there, you can see it. But this was a common trick in Charleston, and added a little bit character, but 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 really a very simple structure. I can imagine this being my house, quite frankly, uh, given the scale and the arrangement. Um, Let me see if I can click this. Do you want, Mark, can you try and punch that? The next one, I'm having trouble moving. There you go. Another image back across from the southwest, looking at the pool through the stone walls. We like designing gates, and I don't know if you can see in the distance, other gates. We'd like for them all to be slightly different and quirky and playful. Another view. Um, because of the shade and the value of having some shade, we often on porches, summer porches, incorporate curtains just so in full sunlight during summer it can give you a bit of shade, uh, and keep the sun off you and keep things cool. Um, Farm buildings beyond. Uh, the interior, uh, was a lot of fun. Um, this is Ralph's happy, light touch. Kind of a riff on Gunston Hall with its chinoiserie. Um, and we ultimately decoupaged an old map on those folding cabinet doors that conceals a television. Um, Lattice work, top of wall and ceiling. Uh, um, Lots of blue, lots of summer colors, and doors thrown open. And it's a beautiful spot to just sort of sit and while away the hours. Uh, the youngest child, Annie, there to the right, best friend of my daughter's, um, looking west. Um, Young Annie looking west. Uh, but a great spot, and this was we had fun with this. Um, this one was perhaps this is the last. This may be the last project I'll show you tonight. This was perhaps the hardest one we've been involved in a number of years. Um, this was a house that I thought this is a property that was situated in the back of Farmington Country Club proper in Charlottesville, Virginia. This was a house on a beautiful piece of land, totally overgrown. Um, and I thought this would be an opportunity to buy a wreck, fix it, sell it. Um, Unfortunately, my wife at the time saw it, and she imagined that this would be a place that we could create a kind of a garden country oasis close in town, near to the girls' schools. Um, and so we ended up with this incredible overgrown wreck, which is looking kind of forlorn there on this little hilltop. Um, Punching buttons here to change screens, and nothing's happening. There. Hold on, folks. There. Thank you, Mark. Um, this is what the front looks like now. Uh, I know it's hard to imagine, um, but because of that downhill slope and the dimensional circumstances, I was able to add this Palladian front uh, with this arcaded ground floor and triple sash windows at what became a little dining sitting room and pediment above, which ultimately was the girls' bathroom, shared bathroom between bedrooms in the attic. Um, it was an amazing rescue. Mark, I may have to call you into task if this thing is not working. Let me just try one more time. Oh, this is good. But the more interesting story, I think, is what happened with the gardens. This is the uphill version where it is truly one story. Um, we often collaborate with good garden designers. One of my favorite is George Carter, who's based in Norfolk, England. We also work with Za Tolamash now and then. She's in Suffolk. Uh, George and Taza and I were collaborating on a project in Virginia. They would stop by, and we brought them to this house to grab a run. And George, sitting there one afternoon with a cup of tea, said, "This is what we could start to do. This is how you could sort of create. This is how you might create a little courtyard in front of the house with a pavilion on axis with the front door. Great composition, adds gives you an opportunity to push into a garden environment. That's kind of cool." I thought it was brilliant. Um, there are lots of other good examples that we started to file away. This is the garden pavilion that Jefferson built at Monticello. separate of the wings at the ends of his arcades. Um, this was a good precedent image for us. Uh, Brooke, my wife at the time, rejected all. she she said we needed more garden in a real pavilion. So this is a watercolor sketch done not by me, but by a friend, of based upon our initial designs, that we would create this array of gardens leading through all of this, to ultimately terminating in this Italian pavilion. Here's the initial diagram. One is that courtyard that George Carter crafted. Two was the fountain that we would use as the hinge that would allow us to reorient you because of the limits of the property in a slightly skewed direction. Three was what we referred to as the Greek Key Garden, with its little pockets and just fantastic native plant material. And four was this hornbeam circus that we were going to clip with absolute precision, a fountain at its front and the pavilion 5 at the end. A quick proportional analysis, that we knew that we were getting things to a point where there was a pleasant rhythm and arrangement to all. Early sketches of the pavilion. And again, we had such fun at Blue Ridge Farm playing with stucco and coins. We thought we would do the same here. But we did all of this in plaster. The only thing wood in this structure are the doors. Everything else is stucco, travertine, plaster. We have a travertine floor, travertine mantelpiece. It was all built unbelievably solid. The idea being that we could leave the doors wide open year in, year out. Proportional analysis, again, to make sure that we're on the mark and we've got it right. And that on every project serves as a useful tool to verify that we're making good steps. We're taking good steps. The plan, again, a golden rectangle, playing with the paving here. Some photographs, the stone walls, and in all of this, we wanted to be playful. That we didn't have a lot of room to work with, so we pushed those stairs to the side beyond those two potted boxwoods. Is the fountain in the distance, but this thing is just thick as could be. And once you step into that world, you can actually basically disappear. And the view ultimately of the pavilion at the end of all of that, with its hornbeam hedge, a little wild to either side. And the beauty of this is we used it year round. It didn't make any difference. It was July 4th, Thanksgiving, Christmas, 2 feet of snow on the ground. We'd have a fire burning in that thing, full tilt, and this was just a happy place to be. We may have enough time. I'm going to show you just one more little bit of a project. We're still midstream on this. Again, a collaboration with Ralph Harvard. This is the front gate of the Archibald Stewart House in Stanton, Virginia. It's the oldest and grandest house in that fair city. Stanton at that time still had log cabins. This was 1791. Standing proudly in front of that gate is our friend, our patron, Scott Goldenberg, with his pockets turned inside out. Scott and his wife, Krista, had approached me a couple of years ago said were thinking about buying an old house in Stanton, sent me a picture of this gate. I knew exactly what it was. The answer was immediately yes. Um, and my response was, we'll do it. I'll do this, but only if I can involve my friend Ralph Harbert. Um, and partly for the sake of having fun, but more importantly, professionally, it was the right thing to do. Understanding your limitations in this world, I think, is a useful way to approach life. And there is no doubt in my mind that the one person that knows more about good colonial architecture than I do is Ralph Harbert. So, of course, I'm going to have my friend involved in this to help guide us. And so, Scott and Krista were absolutely on board. So let's just go. Um, it's a house that is so unusual in character. Um, Archibald Stewart was the executor, agent, lawyer for Thomas Jefferson. He was of a younger generation, schooled at William and Mary, um, generation behind Jefferson, a lawyer, was responsible for all of Jefferson's properties west of Charlottesville. That would include Poplar Forest, Natural Bridge. Uh, Archibald Stewart was involved in helping Lewis and Clark get started on their foray out west. Um, but Archibald Stewart was a smart guy too, and perhaps thought a little bit more of himself from an architectural standpoint than he deserved to. Uh, because Stewart was part of the state legislature, he had been privy to the model of the Maison Carrée that Jefferson had sent back to Richmond when he was in France as a guide for how the capital might be built. Um, Archibald Stewart obviously saw that model and clearly thought to himself, I'm going to do something like this for my house. And copy it, he did. But without perhaps the most complete understanding of the rules of proportion. So in this case, the pediments a little too steep. The chimney stacks a little too tall. The windows a little too broadly spaced. The house probably should have been another 4 or 6 feet wider. Um, the steps a little too long. If we go back to that a composition by John Blackburn, and and as many of you know, John Blackburn was that Virginia architect whose Brian Greene has written extensively on. A beautiful book that he published on him. But clearly, Blackburn's elevation is superior to what ultimately was put in place. Um, so a little too tenuous. The plan incredibly simple, very unusual in some respects. A side-to-side hall, rarely seen in Virginia, as opposed to a center hall. Stair tucked to the side. Um, I would walk those rooms in that house, and you could hear the ghosts of the builders and tradespeople and Archibald Stewart arguing vociferously as to how to put this together because they were literally winging it without drawings, without firm guidance. They got the job done, but it wasn't without some difficulties and problems. Um, it is a fantastic house. I can't really show you interiors. Let me see if I can punch this button here. Mark, do you want to punch the button? I don't know if it's going. We good? Sorry, folks, we're technical difficulties. Did I break it?
Let's try that. How would you advance? Not moving.
Not moving. Well, that's okay. Um, what's interesting to me is that these rules and ideas as to how you use proportions and guide composition, even when you don't get them perfectly right, they're still useful tools. This house has such fantastic presence um, in that view through the gate to the house is so iconic and so important to the community of Stanton that it still works. So whether you absolutely master the rules as a professional or aspire to use them in a fashion to just get the job done, it still works. And I think that's the same. I think that's the one thing I would emphasize the value of in how the world as I see it in terms of architecture works. Uh, and it takes a tremendous amount of practice and repetition and confirmation that you're on the right path, testing ideas, and not being afraid to seek collaboration with those that are smarter about it than you might be. Um, and that's in many respects why I've had so much fun uh, in how we've managed all of this, and I think how it's how we're going to continue to proceed. And all of these formulas, all of these rules, all of these tricks of the trade are as applicable today as they might be in the future. Uh, but enough said. I mean, I've probably run the clock out. Brian, do you want to? Is Brian on?
I am Madison. That was lovely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. That was terrific. And I'm going to open this up to questions here. So I've got the first question in the chat that I'll ask. And if you'd like to ask a question in person, use the raised hand feature, and I'll turn on your microphone. But I'll start out with Noah Duell's question. Can you redesign my 400 square foot apartment? Um, I think there's a
Noah.
real question following that. It's how do these geometric proportions lend themselves to everyday lives, to everyday life? How can we use these?
That's a good question. Um, it's funny. I think you can use it in everything. It's it helps you appreciate the limits to which you can push arrangements, and it keeps you. They serve to remind you as to what, particularly when you physically occupy a space, they tend to help guide you as to what the limits are. Um, you know, I'm 68. I'll be 69 in May. And the circumstances I require for living are dramatically slighter than they were when our girls were running wild. Um, and how one person can occupy a bit of space. Noah, that 400 square feet sounds perfectly delightful to me. And could it be uh, beautifully arranged? Yes. And but you're going to ultimately make choices as to what the focus is. Um, and but these guidelines, these proportional guidelines certainly help.
So, Madison, I have a question, and this sort of goes back to get in the time machine for a moment and go way back, and when you're way back, go one step further. It just reflecting upon your time with Jack Robinson, both as a teacher and as an employer. What did you learn from him that what, if anything, did you learn from him that you've carried with you to today?
Wow. Um, you may have to cut me off. I could talk for an hour on that. Jack was probably one of the smartest people I had ever met in my life. Um, he was shockingly well spoken. Uh, he was a Rhodes Scholar. His intention initially was not to study architecture. Um, he came from a family of bankers, lawyers, diplomats. He grew up in China. His father, at one point, was, I believe, ambassador or liaise at the close during the Second World War for China. Um, and so he was very worldly in that regard. Uh, Amazingly well spoken and studious. Was as keen to understand a Shakespeare poem as he might be why a particular Chinese vase was beautiful. This guy he was like a Bernard Berenson. He absorbed everything. Um, I think it was that whole notion of his interest in the richness of life that was a guide for me. That there was little value in being just a good architect. The real value was being a good citizen or a player in the world and being willing to contribute something across the board, to be effective and a good uh, a, a compliment to your community. Um, Jack was that in spades. Uh, his his commitment to public practice in the good of the greater world, as well as to his private architectural work, was absolutely equal. Um, as a young man, John Lindsay brought him on board to help with a number of young Turks. They were all Yale guys, uh, to run the Office of City Planning for Manhattan. And that was a critical stage for New York. Huge transition from this a world of manufacturing and an industry in New York to what New York was becoming, a financial center. And there was a lot of hard work that had to be put into to make the city livable. Uh, but yeah, you're gonna have to cut me off now. But he was he was a rock star. But he also introduced me to a cadre of other practitioners, architects, academics. And that was also equally important. I traveled a lot with him as a TA. I had TA positions at Princeton. Uh, I lectured as a young guy. Um, it's NYU, at Yale, at Columbia. Uh, and he taught me how to involve myself in the conversation as to the value of architecture and how you make the world a better place, whether it's a city or a house, it's the same thing.
Wonderful. Thank you. Um, Question from Michael Phillips. When furnishing, decorating an historic interior, how do you think geometric proportions of the architecture figure into your design choices?
Oh, okay. Well, I know Michael. He's at the School of, he's studying architectural history at the University of Virginia now. Super smart guy. Um, and I look for furniture that has not only that exhibits character of craft, but is playful in terms of geometry. And the beauty, and I particularly love good American furniture. was an interest of many of my family, many of my family. Um, and that's the beauty of Newport, Rhode Island. That whole clan of Newport and Boston furniture designers, the Townsends, the Goddards. There's a whole list of fantastic American furniture that was coming out of those places. But because it was colonial, because it was America, it couldn't be, in some respects, as fancy as what was coming out of London. So there was a much more streamlined, nuanced character to furniture. So that's of interest to me. At the same time, I don't want any house, any structure to be one dimensional. It doesn't have to be like a museum to one particular period. So I think for anybody, the smart thing is to think long enough to decide what goes well with everything else, um, and to be to learn how to be a collector. And what's fantastic about this world today is that I'm able to buy at auction shockingly beautiful pieces of furniture that cost less at times than what it takes for me to buy it from IKEA, if you hit the auction at the right time. Um, and that's the beauty of being patient, being thoughtful, looking for things that sort of fit a bigger picture in your life and that are beautiful, proportionally beautiful.
Thank you. And last two questions here. I'll start first to the last. Agnes Lisa Baker. I encountered a residential complex apartments, I believe, mid-rise buildings in a community in West Berlin in 1888 of Jack Robertson's design. At a glance, the buildings had no relationship to classical form. Was Robertson's work grounded in or influenced by classical traditions?
Okay, so that project was actually not a Jack Robertson project. That was a Peter Eisenman project. That was the apartment complex at Checkpoint Charlie, which was built just before the wall came down in Berlin. Um, and to your to her credit, she's absolutely right. And that's the beauty of this whole notion of how you handle proportional relationships. It doesn't have to be classical or fully traditional. There are architects of more recent eras, um, that practice with the sensitivity to proportion in how buildings, how circumstances fit within a particular environment, urban environment. So your your questioner, however we'll identify her, um, is absolutely spot on. There are fundamental proportional relationships there. Perhaps it could have gone a bit further. That guided that project in order to knit it within an unusual zone, um, which has been made somewhat complex because the wall's not there anymore. They tore it down, um, and that was a major element in terms of driving the design of that project.
Thank you. Thank you. And Madison, to wrap this up, I just want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. This has been lovely. And I want to give you a question to close out with, which
Sure.
is you showed us some lovely projects, some really, really wonderful work. Is there a building type that you've always wanted to build but haven't yet had the chance?
Wow.
Is there something you've always wanted to make?
Well, I always want to make everything. Um, but I've never had the opportunity to design a truly public project where ceremony is of paramount importance. Um, that could be, and I'm not a religious person. Um, I'm more of an atheist these days, I think. Uh, but a lecture hall, a library. Um, I'll tell you a story if we have just a minute more. One of the most important things that happened to me as a young man when we had first moved to Charlottesville. Uh, our first daughter had been born, and to uh, there's no better garden to take a child for a walk in than the University of Virginia, the gardens on the lawn. And I would take our eldest daughter, ultimately our second, number two daughter, Elsie and Millie, to walk the colonnades, walk the lawn, and we would inevitably, particularly if it was raining or too sunny, walk into the rotunda. I remember vividly approaching that upper library floor of the rotunda, which had been set up for a lecture, and we were the only people in the room. And we were walking about. Elsie approached the dais, stood on that platform, holding on to the lectern, and struck a pose, her back perfectly straight, looking out over the world. And it made me realize, and I saw this happen on more than one occasion with both girls. It made me realize that great architecture leads people to lead better lives. If they can influence you in terms of how you conduct your personal affairs, it can influence you as to how you walk a street. It can dictate how you carry yourself in a public forum. I think that would be the greatest honor to partake in as an architect. But it's a hope and a dream. But the fact of the matter is, you can do it even on a small scale with a house. But let me tell you, there's a reason people like Churchill spoke so beautifully, or a Barack Obama could speak so beautifully, or standing in a public realm. It just it helps you lead a better life. That's all I want to do, quite frankly. I'm not smart enough. I come from my brothers are lawyers. Uh, I wasn't smart enough to be a lawyer. I want to set a proper stage. My goal in life is to set a stage upon which people might lead better lives. That's all I want to do.
Well, that's lovely. That's absolutely wonderful. And Madison, thank you so much for joining us. And I think that's the perfect note to say thank you. And and thank everyone for joining us this evening. This has really been lovely. And as always, Madison, this has been a privilege. And and want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And we hope if you're a member, thank you for coming. If you're not a member, think about joining with us. And we'll in our newsletter we'll have our next a next speaker in this series, which we hope to see everyone again before too long. So again, thank you, Madison, for bringing this together tonight.
Thank you, Brian.